So what we're going to do in our time together this afternoon around church planting is Superintendent Ben asked me to walk through some basic models of church planting. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, so it's not going to be super different. But we will have time to unpack these a little more fully. So I'm going to leave a lot of room in this discussion or in this presentation for discussion so that we can unpack what some of these different things might look like. I am not projecting for this particular talk because I want this to be a conversation. So really there's about three different categories of church plants. There's what I call startup churches, which are churches that are brand new. They're not connected to another church. They're just brand new startup churches. There's multiplication churches. These are born out of churches that reproduce other churches, and so we'll talk about some of those models. And then there are turnaround churches, which are in that relaunch category. And of course, there's always the accidental church plant, which is the usually as the result of division that happens. We just categorize that as a church plant. It sounds better than a church split, right? Yeah. So we're going to talk about those four types of models. We're not really going to talk about churches that are accidentally started because we don't believe in church splits. We don't want to divide, we want to multiply. So we're going to focus on the multiplication kinds of planting. So let's focus first on startup churches. So startup churches are churches that stand alone, that don't share the DNA of another church. Okay, so my dad was a church planter, and so he did a model that's called pioneering. And this is really a common model used in a lot of Latino communities as well. But when I was young, this was the primary church planting methodology. And sometimes it's called the parachute model. You know, your superintendent says, we need a church over here. Good luck, son or daughter. Go make it happen. And so a small team, maybe as small as a one person or a couple, will start a work in a new town or an unreached population. And this model typically starts out very relationally based. It starts small and it grows very slowly. It's often funded via conferences or networks or denominations, or maybe sometimes these pastors raise their support like a missionary would raise their support. And but often it's money coming in from outside of the community that's funding this particular type of church. Now, this model requires enormous stamina and requires a lot of hard work to reach critical mass before it can become self-sustaining. Honestly, this isn't the best model in America for sure, or in American culture. So the best kind of leader to do this kind of model, though, really needs to be a high D, high I kind of personality, and needs to be very entrepreneurial because nobody's telling them what to do. They're just out there on their own. They're creating everything. There are no traditions. You know, one of the traditions that my dad created is for the first 3 weeks, it was me, my mom, and my sister. So tithes weren't great. But after that, this elderly couple and elderly woman started coming. And the gentleman would sit on one side of the couch, his wife would sit in the middle, and the elderly woman would sit on the other side of the couch. And the older gentleman and the single elderly woman would fall asleep, and the woman would be sitting here doing this. But my dad believed in preaching whether anybody was paying attention or not, so that worked out okay. But so it takes a certain kind of leader because that can be discouraging, right? And, these slow beginnings. And in American culture, you really don't have viability where visitors feel like they're not stepping into an intimate gathering until you're 35, 40 people, okay? So it takes a long time to get to that threshold using this kind of a start, especially if the person's going into a community they're not familiar with and they've just got to build relationships. So people that do this well are also likely going to be serial planters. So if you're somebody like this, can I just encourage you, if you love to start something from nothing, you're a rare breed. Talk to your superintendent. They will put you to use. But often the skill set that's required to get a church from 0 to 40 people is a totally different skill set than taking a church of 40 people and building it to 100 or 200 or whatever. So often the people with those entrepreneurial gifts will grow the church up to maybe 80 people and then grow it right back down to 3. And so the best thing that you can do with those kind of entrepreneurial leaders is let them be serial entrepreneurs and let them build churches from 0 to 80 and then hand it off to somebody else. So I just want to encourage you that way. So one of the key indicators to watch here is whether or not the church can become sustaining within the first 36 months. Most of the time when you're dealing with church plants, it's a shorter evaluation window. But because of the really difficult nature of getting this off the ground, it has a longer plant cycle. So really 36 months is your kind of make it or break it point. And just recognize that somebody told me once that it takes 90% of the fuel in the tanks to get the space shuttle the first 10 feet off the ground. Feels like that when you're doing this kind of church plant. And so recognize and support the leaders that are doing that. So I honestly, in the United States, this is not a very successful methodology. Most of these fail. So you hear statistics like 80% of all church plants fail. What they really mean is, 95% of all of this kind of church plant fails, and it ruins the statistics for everyone else, okay? So, this is not a very good, but there are certain ethnicities where this is working really well. So so church planting models can be different depending on your context. So the next kind of startup model is missional communities. And so these are almost always started really in a small group idea at first. So they're usually launched by a team or by a bivocational pastor. So really right out of the gate, there's no thought that we're going to have to raise the support of this person. Often they're working and starting a missional community on an evening a week or maybe on a weekend or so on. And usually they shoot for regular gatherings of 20 to 50 people, which is really starts to be the critical mass for viability of this kind of model, who want to reach their specific neighborhood and their network of relationship for Christ. And so often this looks like a small group that gets together infrequently for worship. So what you see in this kind of model is it really is like a small group in somebody's home, and then eventually as this model grows, there's multiple small groups in various homes, and they might come together once a month or once a quarter for kind of worship and baptism or that kind of a thing, maybe a prayer and praise. So this community can grow into a formal congregation, but honestly, the type of people that are attracted to this model resist that. And so oftentimes they just keep growing these cells, keep growing these missional communities. They're very service-oriented, often Often you'll see, instead of gathering today, we're all going to go serve at such and such homeless shelter, we're going to pick up stuff in the park or whatever. They can do that because there are no such thing as first-time guests that aren't in deep relationship with somebody in that group. Okay, so they don't have drive-by first-time guests in a missional community. In fact, nobody even knows that they're there unless somebody invites them to that missional community. So this is a very popular model, especially among millennials. It's pretty low cost, frankly, to start because often it's starting in somebody's home or in a coffee shop. And because the pastor's bivocational, then there's not a lot of staff to support. Frankly, it's really hard in this model to ever get to supporting vocational staff. And the model sort of resists it. So that can be a challenge to scaling because oftentimes these get stuck around 2 or 3 groups of 20 to 50 because they don't have the bandwidth for the administration it would take to grow. So this model is being promoted like by the Verge Network and Alan Hirsch, that kind of group, as well as house church proponents like Frank Viola or the late C. Peter Wagner and folks like that. So super popular with millennials and people that are disenfranchised with the church. Okay? So most of the time, the people that are excited to join this model of church are people that have been hurt by church. And they really just want a safe, smaller community. I honestly have not seen, even though it's called a missional community model, I've really not seen a missional community model grow very quickly with people far from Jesus. It can, and they do. It's just a slower path because it's so relationally, and our relational networks don't grow quickly, right? So you have to set your expectations properly. I know of a number of these missional communities that are healthy and thriving. But if your idea is, hey, we're going to plant a church and we want to reach 200 people or 500 people in this neighborhood, this probably isn't the model that you're going to want to use. But it can be very effective. So there's the large launch model. This is the other primary model for startup churches where you're just going from scratch with a new church. This has been popularized primarily by the Southern Baptists as well as the Association of Related Churches. And so you see this being promoted by Nelson Searcy or Aubrey Malfers and folks like that. So this is where a small team, usually about 3 pastors, maybe even more, start working in a new town or an unreached population. They usually have a ramp of somewhere between 3 to 6 months where they're in the community and they're doing all kinds of networking in the community and trying to build excitement through community outreach, through core group meetings. Often this is accompanied by marketing and advertising, and they're trying to let people know, hey, we're going to have this big launch at a future date. And so they usually have 3 to 6 months, I'm going to just call it a building time, where they're building momentum. And then they often will have a 1 to 3 month preview service time where they're practicing for the big launch. And then they have a big launch. Honestly, there's almost 3 days a year that most of these churches launch, and Easter's a big one, Super Bowl, the Sunday after the Super Bowl, and then in the first couple of weeks after Labor Day. So right around the end of September or first part of October. So those are kind of the big days where they launch these kinds of things. So it's pretty common that they'll send out mailers, that they'll take out ads, and just generally send out to the community. And their hope is that they're going to launch with a critical mass on day one after big launch of at least 140 people. 140 to 250 is what they think of as critical mass. And so if you don't hit that number, it's not uncommon for denominations to close the effort down if they don't hit that number. Here's why they need that big of a number on the big launch. Because they lose, within about 3 months, they're going to lose about half of those people because it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. They really didn't have commitment in it. This model often attracts, again, disenfranchised church people that are looking for a better delivery because they don't like the church they're in for some reason, and this cool new flyer came, so they're going to check it out. And so people come in and check it out, and then sometimes it just kind of float back to wherever they're doing. So you have to have a big launch in order to have critical mass to support the infrastructure that sustains. And so listen, this has been a very effective model all over the United States. So I'm not knocking this model at all. It is working very successfully for the Association of Related Churches and in the United States and Canada, as well as for the Southern Baptists all over. It is a costly option. So it usually costs between $200,000 and $300,000 to launch a church in using this kind of model. And the common thought is if this church doesn't hit 200 people by the start of year 2, it's not going to survive. So again, those are some of the metrics that people use to determine viability. Also, if this church isn't self-sufficient financially within the first year, it usually doesn't survive either, because when they lose denominational funding or wherever their funding source happens, then they have to start laying off staff, and that usually results in people feeling disappointed and can often cause them to lose some other people. So those are some of the challenges around that model. But again, this model is being successfully used all over the United States and Canada. And there are a lot of great churches that you know the name of those churches that were started this way. North Point not being is probably the most popular, but there's all kinds of them. So multiplication churches. So let's move into the second category. These are churches that are started by other churches. So instead of denominations or pastors with a calling or people feeling, hey, we need to go start a church, this is where churches are reproducing churches. Frankly, this methodology has the least percentage of failure. Okay, because they also have mentoring and support. And so there's a lot of things that happen in this that cause them to succeed at a much higher ratio than some of the other models. So some of the things I want to point out about multiplication churches, these types of planting methodologies is the reason they're successful is because they're connected, both relationally and there's coaching involved with the lead pastor. There's often support that comes alongside. So all of these churches carry some portion of DNA from the church that mothers them. And so that's really what defines these kinds of churches. So there's a couple of different strains of this model, so I'm going to deal with a couple of those. And if you want my notes, I'll send them to you. So if you're worried about taking them down, don't worry about it. So the first kind of umbrella for a number of models is called one church, many expressions. Okay, so this is where churches multiply by creating churches that replicate their exact DNA. So they're really just replicating themselves exactly in some other location. And so it may or may not be important in that model for these to be self-supporting financially. That would depend on the missional goal of the parent church and what they're trying to accomplish. So often the leaders in these types of church plants are subordinate to the parent church. And so they require leaders to be campus pastors who are not overly visionary or ambitious. Because if they're too overly visionary and ambitious, they want to change the DNA, and that causes a break from the parent, right? So that's okay, and we'll talk about a model where that's effective. But if you as a pastor are thinking, hey, we want to start using this model to branch out, the kind of leader you're going to look for is somebody who's really dependable and encouraging and so on, but is not overly visionary or ambitious. If you're going to do that, then you probably just want to plant a church that's going to have their own governance and that kind of thing. So here's some expressions of the one church, many places kind of model. So the first one is venues, or housed churches, they're sometimes called. So these are churches that share the DNA of the parent but have a varied style. And often they're housed in the same facility. So they're just reaching a different subgroup in the community, or even a different culture. So the most popular church that's used this model is Larry Osborne. So down in San Diego. So, their church has, even at the same time, they've got on the same campus, 5 or 6 different styles of church that are happening, reaching different segments of the population. And so they function as one church, but also as a collection of churches, really. So it's that one church, multiple venues. So this is really an effective way. So in the turnaround story that I shared in the past session, I pastored a church that had this methodology. So we started out as a single style, a single culture that was dying. And in the course of turnaround, we planted 3 other churches inside of our own church. So the church I was pastoring was super traditional, and they all got up before Jesus, I'm really sure, because they wanted me to have Easter services at 5 in the morning. It's ridiculous. But so we started a service as early as I was willing to come at 8 o'clock, and that was a more traditional service. Now I just want to say it was a missional service still. We didn't cater to the preferences. We said, we realize there's a lot of people in this community that might enjoy this kind of service. And so we're going to have a missional service that's this style at 8 o'clock in the morning. Then we're going to have a completely different style of worship at 11. And had the band and the loud music, and people that were older that came to that service typically wore earplugs. And, it was a much younger and reached a completely different. Then we had a large Hispanic community in our community, so we started a Spanish service, a Latino service, and then we realized that there were a significant number of uneducated people, and they were single moms, single dads. Some of them were married, but they didn't have any money. They didn't have a high educational level, so we started having an afternoon service on Sunday where we offered a meal, and then we did what I would call a children's sermon. So, it was super simple, and we often used props, and it was highly engaging. There was activities, and people could come with their kids. We didn't have kids, it was all right here. And we aimed it at the kids, but we knew that their parents that was their understanding and educational level too. And so what happened? People came to faith in Christ, and so that became one of our. So that's an example of this kind of style. So we were one church organizationally, and we only met in 2 different locations, but we were meeting 4 very distinct cultures. Okay, so also the next kind of variation of this is what's called multi-site campuses. So this is where the parent church says, you know what, we're going to replicate our exact thing that we're doing over here. And we're going to now have a campus in, I don't know this area well enough to say this, but you know what, we're going to have it in this suburb and this suburb and this one, that are kind of connected, and we're going to do that. Now, multi-site is super popular right now, but can I just tell you, this is an ancient idea. This is not new. The Catholics used to call this the cathedral church model, right? So, the idea of there's a regional church that's stronger, and we're going to help plant some parish churches out here around in other communities. So this is a model that the church has been practicing for centuries. So it's a very effective model right now. Here's what a lot of denominations are finding is that it is unbelievably expensive to build anything that seats over 500 people. I mean, it is just crazy expensive anywhere in the United States to build anything that's over 500 people because of code, fire codes and municipal code. It's just super expensive. So for the same amount of money that you could build a sanctuary that seats 1,500, you could have 3 sanctuaries that seat 500. And you can run multiple services. So you can grow that to 3, maybe even 4,500 people. So economically, a lot of churches are realizing, hey, we need to go out instead of building up. If you get that idea. And so also one of the interesting things in the U.S. right now with the new generation especially is there's a little bit of backlash against the idea that bigger is better. And so younger people tend to be attracted to smaller venues. So there's a lot of mega churches right now in the United States that don't have a single venue that has more than 250 people in it. And they're running 6,000 people on a weekend. So that takes lots of coordination, and there's lots of things that have to happen there. But this is a very effective strategy. It puts less money into facility and more money into the mission. And so it can be a really great option if you're in a growing church. So now here's the thing. This has a geographical limitation. This doesn't work if the campuses are more than 45 minutes apart. Okay, so for whatever reason, 45 minutes seems to be the cap on the ability of people to keep those connected in the same DNA. What has happened when they start to get further out is they start to feel disconnected, and over time those tend to branch out into their own DNA or an accidental church plant or etc. So if you're going to take that kind of rationale, keep that in mind. So the next kind of style related to that is called microsite campuses. This is becoming increasingly popular, especially among millennials. What this is that these smaller churches, these microsites, share the DNA, the culture of the parent church, but they're meeting in settings that are intentionally less than 100 people. So often you'll see these in coffee shops in the evening, like on Sunday evening at a coffee shop when the coffee shop might normally be closed, or they don't have a lot of business coming in on Sunday night, so they let a church come in there and meet. And so, the coffee shop's only going to hold 40 people or maybe 60 people. And I'm seeing this all over the country being utilized very, very effectively. Honestly, there's a lot of rural churches that are doing this. A lot of times you think, well, we have to be a big church to plant a church. Nuh-uh. This is a model that even small churches can do. because it's typically not very costly. You don't necessarily have to hire staff. It doesn't cost a lot. A lot of times they can work out with the coffee shop where if people that are there buy so much coffee or whatever the case may be, then you can use it for free. Otherwise, you pay a couple $100 or whatever it is. Often this can be a really low cost kind of model. Also, what is being discovered with this model is that coffee houses just have a native vibe for community and kind of relationship and discussion. So there's a lot of a trend right now. People that are using microsites are doing what's called conversational church. So instead of the pastor giving just a 30-minute sermon, the pastor maybe gives a 5-minute talk, and then with some other people will have a conversation with everybody there. Let's talk about this. What troubles you about this passage? What's exciting? So actually, churches that are doing that are really being successful at converting people and discipling because people are engaged. And so one of the things this is a side note, and you can get this for free, okay? So culture used to be where attendance was the leading indicator and engagement was the trailing indicator. So attendance was the big number we were looking for, and that told us if a certain number of people attended, then we knew they would engage later. Right now, culture, it's flipped. So engagement is the leading indicator. People will engage with your church before they will come. Okay, so rethinking how do we get people to engage with Jesus? How do we get them to engage in our church if we're expecting them to engage before they attend regularly on a Sunday morning? And so this is an answer where a lot of churches are using these microsites because it's not a big barrier for lost people to show up at a coffee shop. Huge barrier to get them to show up at your church because they feel like they're crashing a wedding. They don't know why they would come. But you invite them to a coffee shop, they're there all the time. Furthermore, they're used to putting money in the... Oh, never mind. So then there's this other model where this happens, and I'm going to call it missional outposts. And these are churches that are designed to reach marginalized populations, but are not intended to be self-sustaining. Okay, they require a mother church because they can't become self-sustaining in themselves. Honestly, we're probably going to have to plant more of these kinds of churches in some of the poor urban and poor rural areas that we minister in, because there is an inability economically for those areas to self-support a church until some revitalization occurs. And so that's another way. So then there's another type. So if it's not one church, many locations, there's another style that I'm going to call parent-affiliated churches. Okay, and so this is a church plant model where the parent plants an affiliated church over there. So we're connected relationally, but we're not necessarily sharing the same exact methodology or the same exact vision or the same name or anything like that. So oftentimes a parent will plant one of these affiliated churches and say, you have 24 months. And then you're on your own. Good luck with that. Or you have 12 months or something like that. And so they coach and they stay connected. Sometimes they share financial bookkeeping and some of those kinds of things. But really they're kind of on their own. So this is a little bit higher risk than sort of the one church, many expressions model because it tends not to have the same level of support. But this is way less risky than the parachute drop or the large church launch. So here's the big thing. With this model, if you plant a parent-affiliated church, you have to realize what often happens is the parent church says, we're going to send 100 people over here and we're going to plant a church. And everybody's like, yes, I want to be a part of this plan. I'm going to go over there. And so they go over there, and then within 36 months, they're back at the main campus. Okay? So that church has to replace all those people plus grow in order to be self-sustaining within that 36-month window. Because in almost every case, almost 85% of the people that came from the mother will go back to the mother within 36 months. Just a note. So then we talked about relaunching churches. This is a model you use if you're turning around a church. We talked about that earlier, so I'm not going to talk about it at all. So I want to open this up for questions. But before I do, I want to tell two different church stories real briefly to help you catch a vision for this. One is the story of a very traditional church. It had been a really prominent church in Seattle in its denomination, and it was kind of the old money church, you know, and it had been a huge church, like 1,200 people, and then as time went on, the kids moved out to the suburbs, and the parents were still living in the city, but they weren't reaching people in their neighborhood, and so the church started to decline. My friend Verlin Fosner became the pastor there and realized, you know what, we're going to die. We have a timeline. And so they began to explore as a church, what can we do to really reach our city for the gospel? What we're doing isn't working. What can we do? And they pioneered a model called community dinners. Some people call it dinner church, which is popular outside the United States, but isn't quite as popular inside the United States. And what they did is they mapped out all the neighborhoods in their community, and they said, we're going to plant a community dinner in every single one of these neighborhoods where people can walk up to the community dinner. We're going to have a meal, and we're going to talk to people about Jesus. Or build relationship and have conversation. It's going to be missional dinners. And they have been very effective. So they were declining, and they had about 350 people when they started to do this. They now have 9 campuses with almost 1,100 people. What is a campus to them is these dinner churches where people in the community who are just lonely or that want to build relationships, a free dinner, they come. People are encountering Jesus. They have just amazing stories. If you want to know more about that, it's dinnerchurchcollective.net, and I encourage you to do that. Verlin is doing a lecture series with Asbury and partnering with Seed on some books and so on like that. Or you can go to communitydinners.com and see that's their face there. So the other church I wanted to mention is City Point Church in a rural county north of Seattle. And this is a church that was in the county seat of that county, and it had been running 200 people for a really long time. That was kind of, they capped out, I guess, in their area, or at least they were plateaued. And so my friend Mike Acker became the pastor there, and he said, you know what? I think really what it is in the size of town that we're in, people don't like big churches necessarily. So we're gonna take a multiplication model. We're gonna start planting churches. And so between 2011 and 2015, the church grew from 220 people to 540 people in average weekend attendance, with 156 conversions evidenced by baptism. And they acquired, how they did this is they acquired and relaunched 2 churches that had failed. So the denomination said, hey, this church is going out of business, we're going to give it to you. And so both of those churches had under 30 people in attendance. And so they took over that campus and relaunched a church in there, and it grew pretty rapidly. They also planted a completely different church using the apparent affiliated church model that has a different name, different vibe, and successfully planted that's running 120 people. So they now have 3 campuses that are doing church as City Point Church the same way, and a church that's doing it totally different right down the street from their main campus and is also running over 100 in attendance. Then they decided, you know what? We like this cafe church model, so we're going to do that too. So they identified some smaller communities on the edge of the county that really didn't justify building a main campus in those communities, but they all had coffee shops or bakeries. And so they started doing cafe church model. And they've planted 2 cafe churches last I checked, both of which are running between 40 and 60 and are connected around the same thing. So what I want to point out is that's a church. I mean, the entire county has about 100,000 people, and it's huge geographically. It's really a big county. But yet they have figured out that, you know what, we're not going to be limited by the fact that we're in a smaller area. We're just gonna keep doing the mission wherever we can find, and that's been very successful. So I'm going to be done now. We have about 10 or so minutes that we can answer questions, or if you want to unpack any more of these, I'm very happy to do that.